The creek behind Ethan Parker's home had always been a constant presence in his life. Its soft murmuring at night, the way sunlight danced across the ripples in the morning, and the occasional flash of a silver fish beneath the surface gave the water a personality of its own. It was more than a natural feature. It was part of the neighborhood's quiet charm. In early spring, Ethan noticed something unusual. The once steady stream seemed sluggish, the sound of flowing water muted. A few dry patches appeared where there had never been any before, and the air near the bank smelled faintly of still water. Curiosity tugged at him. After lunch that Saturday, he laced up his old hiking shoes and followed the creek upstream. It didn't take long to find the source of the problem. Behind one of the largest homes on the street, a brand new slab of concrete stretched across. The creek bed like a low dam. The water trickled through a narrow gap at one side, but most of it pooled up, spreading into a shallow pond behind the barrier. Standing on the public walking path that bordered the property, Ethan took in the scene, with quiet surprise. The homeowner, Karen, was someone he knew by reputation, a board member for the local homeowners association, known for her attention to every detail of community landscaping and maintenance. She was often seen in her wide-brimmed sun hat, pruning hedges or arranging flower beds in perfect symmetry. That afternoon, she was in her backyard chatting with a neighbor over the fence. The concrete work looked fresh. The edges were still bright and unweathered. Nearby, a wheelbarrow and a stack of paving stones sat waiting, suggesting more construction was planned. Ethan didn't approach immediately. Instead, he studied the way the water moved, or rather, didn't move. Downstream from the barrier, the creek bed looked unusually dry, the water only trickling along one narrow channel. The tadpoles and minnows he often saw darting about were nowhere in sight. Back at home, Ethan couldn't shake the thought. He understood the appeal of personalizing one's property, but the creek wasn't just a decorative feature. It was part of a network of small waterways that wound through the county, designed to carry excess rainwater away from the neighborhood during storms. Blocking its flow could cause unexpected consequences. The next morning, he decided to have a polite word with Karen. She answered the door with her usual composed smile. "Morning, Karen," Ethan began. "I was walking along the creek yesterday and noticed some new concrete work. I wanted to check. Was that part of an HOA project?" Karen's smile held, but her posture straightened slightly. "Oh no," she said. "That was my idea. I wanted to create a decorative pond behind the house. The HOA board knows about it. It's going to make the whole area look more refined." Ethan nodded slowly. "It does look neat, but the creek's actually part of a county waterway system. If the flow gets restricted, it might cause flooding during heavy rain. Have you had it checked with the county?" Karen waved a hand lightly. "I don't think that will be a problem. The pond is shallow and we've had dry springs before. Besides, it's my property. The creek is just a nice feature to work with." Ethan thanked her for her time and left without pressing further, but her answer only deepened his concern. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he stood on his back porch and listened to the creek's muted trickle. The water seemed restless, its surface still and reflective where it used to move freely. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The barrier might seem harmless now, but nature had a way of reminding people that it followed its own rules. And he had a feeling the creek's lesson was coming sooner than anyone expected. The next few days brought clearer skies and warmer afternoons, but Ethan's unease didn't fade. From his porch, he could see the creek running low and slow, as though the water itself had grown tired. The gentle ripple that once reflected the sky had become a narrow thread winding lazily downstream. Ethan wasn't one to stir trouble without reason, but he also wasn't the type to ignore something that could impact the whole neighborhood. The creek wasn't just a pretty feature for those who lived beside it. It was part of a living system, and he knew small changes could ripple out into bigger consequences. On Wednesday evening, he spotted Karen tending to a neat row of planters along her back patio. The sun hat was in place and a small rake lay beside her on the grass. She looked up as Ethan approached, her expression open but expectant. "Evening, Karen," Ethan said with a friendly tone. "Evening, Ethan. Out for another walk along the creek?" "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about our last chat. I just wanted to make sure the water flow behind your place won't cause problems for anyone else." Karen brushed soil from her gloves. "I appreciate your concern, but I really don't see an issue. I've created a lovely pond and the board hasn't objected. I even think it might increase nearby property values. It looks much nicer than a muddy creek bed." Ethan kept his voice calm. "It's true the pond looks peaceful, but the creek's purpose isn't just aesthetic. It helps channel rainwater from higher ground, especially during storms. If the water can't move quickly enough, it could back up." Karen straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly, though her smile didn't fully fade. "I understand you like things the way they were, but I've improved my section. I've left a gap for the water to pass. It's more than enough." Ethan nodded, though inside he felt she was missing the point. "Have you checked with the county records? The creek is marked as part of a designated drainage system. Even small changes can have large effects downstream." Karen tilted her head. "Ethan, I've lived here long enough to know this area. We've had heavier rains than usual before and nothing's flooded. I think you're worrying too much." There was no argument in his tone when he replied, only a steady assurance. "I hope you're right. But I've seen situations like this go wrong. If the creek backs up, it won't matter whose property it is. The water will go where it wants." She didn't respond immediately, instead turning back toward her planters. "Well, I'll keep an eye on it," she said finally, her voice lighter again. "If there's a problem, I'll take care of it." Ethan thanked her and walked away, though his mind was already turning over the next step. She didn't seem, inclined to make changes, and he suspected the HOA might not have been fully briefed on the scope of the work. That night, he pulled out an old binder where he kept maps and documents related to the property. The creek's path was clearly marked, along with notations about water management systems dating back to when the neighborhood was first developed. He made a mental note to visit the county office in the morning to confirm the regulations. Outside, the moonlight reflected off the still surface of the pond that had formed behind Karen's concrete barrier. To anyone passing by, it might have looked picturesque, a mirror of the stars surrounded by manicured lawns. But Ethan saw something else. A system interrupted, a balance shifted, and in his experience, nature rarely stayed quiet when its balance was disturbed. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Ethan had already decided what needed to be done. He couldn't rely on casual conversations or half measures. If there was a real risk to the creek and the neighborhood, he needed facts, not opinions. He drove into town to the county administration building, a squat brick structure that had stood for decades. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the kind of scent that clung to government offices. After a short wait, a clerk named Marissa greeted him at the front desk. "I'm looking for waterway and drainage records for the neighborhood along Cedar Grove," Ethan explained. Marissa led him to a workstation in the corner where a digital map of the county filled the screen. Layers of color-coded lines marked roads, property boundaries, and waterways. With a few quick clicks, she zoomed in on the familiar curve of the creek behind his home. "This here," she said, pointing to the thin blue line, "is an officially designated overflow channel. It's not just a creek. It's part of the stormwater management system for the entire subdivision and some of the land uphill from you." Ethan leaned closer. "So if someone blocks it?" She frowned. "That could be a violation of county code. These channels are designed to move excess water quickly during heavy rain. If they're restricted, water can back up into yards, streets, even homes." The words carried weight. Ethan asked if he could get copies of the relevant sections of the county's environmental management plan. Marissa printed them out along with a floodplain map that showed shaded zones of potential risk. His neighborhood wasn't in a high-risk area, but several yards, including Karen's, bordered the temporary retention zones that would form if the channel overflowed. With the papers in hand, Ethan thanked her and returned home. He spread the documents across his kitchen table, tracing the creek's path with his finger. It ran through 3 neighborhoods, past a small park, and into a larger stream that fed into the county's reservoir. The system had worked quietly and effectively for years, until now. By mid-afternoon, he'd compiled enough information to feel confident in his understanding. The concrete barrier wasn't just a decorative addition, it was an obstruction in a critical drainage path. Ethan sat back in his chair, thinking about how to present this without making the situation adversarial. He wasn't trying to embarrass Karen or pick a fight with the HOA. He simply wanted the creek restored to its proper flow before nature forced the issue. That evening, he decided to take a short walk along the water again. The upstream pond behind, Karen's home gleamed in the late sun, smooth and still, but downstream the bed was almost dry in places. A pair of ducks sat on the muddy bank, looking confused by the lack of movement in the water. As he turned to head back, he saw another, neighbor Thomas, walking toward him with his dog. They exchanged greetings, and Thomas glanced at the creek. "Not much water moving lately, huh?" he said. Ethan nodded. "Karen put in a barrier to make a pond. It's nice to look at, but I'm not sure it's a good idea for the drainage system." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Hope it doesn't cause problems. My basement's never flooded, but I'd rather not find out what it's like." Ethan gave a small smile. "That's exactly why I'm looking into it." When he got home, the printed maps and reports were still spread out across the table. He gathered them into a neat folder. Tomorrow, he decided he would bring the matter to the next HOA meeting, not as a complaint, but as a concern backed by evidence. Because if the rain came and the water rose, there wouldn't be time for discussions. The next HOA meeting took place in the community center, a modest hall with folding chairs arranged in neat rows and the faint scent of fresh coffee drifting from a table in the corner. Ethan arrived early, wanting a good seat near the front so he could lay out his folder of documents without awkward shuffling. A slow trickle of residents came in, chatting in low tones. Karen arrived a few minutes later, wearing her usual sun hat, even indoors, carrying a clipboard. She greeted a few people warmly before taking her place at the head table alongside the HOA president, Martin. Once the meeting was called to order, the usual topics were covered first: landscaping schedules, maintenance updates, and a reminder about the neighborhood garage sale. Ethan waited patiently, glancing occasionally at his notes. When Martin asked if there were any new concerns from residents, Ethan raised his hand. "I'd like to bring up something regarding the creek that runs through the neighborhood," he began. His tone was calm and measured. "Specifically, a recent change to its flow." A few heads turned. Karen's eyes met his, her expression neutral but alert. Ethan stood, holding up a folded map. "I visited the county office last week to confirm some information. The creek behind our homes isn't just a natural feature. It's part of the county's stormwater management system. That means it's designed to handle runoff during heavy rain, preventing flooding in yards, streets, and basements." He opened the map and pointed to the thin blue line. "The water needs to flow freely. If it's blocked or slowed significantly, it can back up into these temporary retention zones. That includes several homes in this neighborhood." Martin leaned forward. "Are you saying someone has blocked the creek?" Ethan kept his gaze steady. "A new concrete barrier was installed upstream, creating a pond. It looks nice, but it reduces water flow. According to the county's environmental management plan, obstructions like that can increase the risk of flooding." A murmur ran through the room. Karen straightened in her chair. "If I may," she said, her voice composed, "the pond on my property has a gap for water to pass through. It's not a complete blockage, and I informed the board about my plans beforehand. There's been no issue so far." Ethan nodded. "I understand, and I'm not here to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. but the flow downstream has slowed to a trickle. Even if there's a gap, it might not be enough during a major storm. I'd like us to consider consulting with the county before we have a problem. Thomas, seated in the third row, raised his hand. I live a few houses downstream. My yard's been muddier than usual. I'd feel better knowing we've checked with the right people. Karen's tone grew slightly firmer. I've invested time and money into improving my property. I don't think it's fair to suggest my pond is a threat without proof of harm, Martin interjected before the discussion could turn tense. No one's saying there's a threat right now. But if Ethan's research is correct, it's worth verifying. We can reach out to the county for an inspection. That way we have an official assessment. Karen hesitated, then gave a small nod. Fine. I have nothing to hide. Let them take a look. Ethan sat back down, relieved the meeting hadn't spiraled into an argument. He knew it was only the first step, but having the HOA agree to an inspection was a small victory. As the meeting wrapped up, the low hum of conversation returned. Some residents glanced at him with curiosity, others with appreciation. Karen kept her expression carefully neutral as she gathered her papers, but Ethan noticed her grip on the clipboard was just a little tighter than before. Outside, the air was warm and still. Ethan looked toward the dark line of trees where the creek wound its way through the neighborhood. For now, the water was quiet, but the forecast had called for rain later in the week. 2 days after the HOA meeting, a white county utility truck rolled slowly down Cedar Grove Lane. It stopped near the curve where Karen's property bordered the creek, and a man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand. Ethan, who had been trimming hedges out front, watched as the man took careful steps toward the water's edge. The inspector introduced himself as Daniel Whitaker from the county's Environmental Management Department. He had a calm, deliberate way of speaking, as if every word was measured. I'm here to take a look at the creek flow, he explained. The HOA requested an evaluation after your last meeting. Karen came out onto her back patio as soon as she saw him. You must be Daniel. I've been expecting you, she said, her voice bright. You'll see the pond I've created? I've left an opening for the water to pass through, so there's no real blockage. Daniel gave a polite nod and began examining the concrete structure. He measured the gap, took photos from different angles, and knelt to check the water depth on both sides of the barrier. Ethan stood a short distance away, not wanting to interfere, but he could see that upstream, the ponded water was calm and deep. Downstream, the creek bed was a series of shallow pools separated by stretches of damp mud. After about 20 minutes, Daniel stepped back and scribbled a few notes on his clipboard. The structure certainly slows the flow, he said evenly. It's not a complete obstruction, but it reduces the creek's capacity to carry stormwater. Karen crossed her arms lightly. But it's still moving, isn't it? I've made it more attractive and it's a peaceful place for wildlife. That's true, Daniel agreed. But in stormwater terms, slower flow means water builds up behind the barrier faster than it can be released. In a heavy rain, that could cause upstream flooding. If the water rises high enough, it can also overtop the bank and move in directions it's not meant to. Ethan stayed quiet, letting the inspector's words stand on their own. Daniel continued. This creek is classified as a secondary drainage channel for 3 neighborhoods. County code requires these to remain unobstructed or to have engineered flow controls that meet our specifications. I'll need to file a formal report and make a recommendation to the county board. Karen's smile thinned. So what happens now? The county will review my findings, Daniel said. If they decide changes are needed, you'll get a notice with options for compliance. That might mean modifying the barrier or replacing it with a structure that allows for higher flow rates. Karen exhaled slowly. I suppose we'll see what they say. Daniel thanked both of them for their time, took a few more photos, and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, the only sound left was the faint trickle of water through the narrow gap in the concrete. Ethan walked over to the edge of the creek. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear," he said to Karen, "but it's better to know now than after a storm causes damage." She gave a small shrug. "I still think it's fine, but I guess the county gets the final say." That afternoon, clouds began to gather on the horizon. The forecast called for steady rain over the next 2 days, nothing extreme, but enough to test the creek's capacity. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the timing might prove Daniel's point sooner than expected. That night, as he listened to the soft patter of rain on his roof, Ethan imagined the water rising slowly behind, the barrier pressing against the concrete. Nature, he thought, had a way of revealing weaknesses, not in anger, but with simple, unstoppable persistence. By morning, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm, drumming softly on rooftops and running in silver streams down driveways. Ethan stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the creek beyond the trees. Even from this distance, he could see the water was higher than usual. Around mid-morning, he pulled on a rain jacket and walked down to the bank. The upstream pond behind Karen's house had expanded noticeably, swallowing patches of grass that had been dry the day before. The water pressed against the concrete barrier, slipping through the narrow gap in a foamy rush. Downstream, the flow was still far weaker than it should have been. Pools of water connected by shallow trickles hinted that much of the rain was being trapped upstream. Karen was on her back porch, holding an umbrella. "The ponds never looked better," she called out with a small smile. "Almost like a lake now." Ethan hesitated before answering. "It's filling quickly. If this rain keeps up, the bank might not hold." She shook her head lightly. "It's fine. We've had worse rain before." But as the afternoon wore on, the clouds deepened and the rain intensified into a heavier, more insistent downpour. The once gentle creek upstream had become a restless body of water, swirling with bits of leaves and small branches. By late afternoon, Ethan spotted something that made his stomach tighten. The water level was now only a few inches below the top of the barrier. The narrow gap had become a turbulent jet, but it still wasn't enough to lower the pond. He decided to walk a little further upstream, past Karen's property line. There, he noticed how the swollen water had started to creep sideways toward the base of a neighbor's fence. The soil was soft, and small rivulets were beginning to form. It was exactly the kind of sideways overflow Daniel had warned about. When Ethan returned home, he called Thomas. "Have you looked outside lately? The water's getting high." Thomas's voice was uneasy. "Yeah, my backyard's soggy. The dog refuses to go out, and I just checked my sump pump. It's running non-stop." Ethan glanced out again. If the rain keeps at this rate tonight, the barrier could turn into a dam. The hours stretched into evening. The steady patter of rain had become a relentless roar on the roof, and the air outside felt thick and heavy. Every so often, Ethan would step onto his porch to check the creek. By now, the pond had overtopped its banks in one section, creating a shallow sheet of water flowing across Karen's side yard. At around 9, a flash of light caught his attention. Karen's back porch light flickered on, and he saw her hurrying outside with a flashlight, aiming it toward the water. Even from a distance, he could tell her confident expression from earlier was gone. She stood for a long moment, watching the restless current, before retreating back inside. Shortly after, Ethan heard another sound, faint at first, then more distinct, the hum of pumps and the rush of water against walls. It was coming from somewhere upstream, and his gut told him it was the sound of a basement sump pump working hard to keep up. The rain showed no signs of letting up. The barrier, the pond, the banks, they were all part of a system being tested by nature, and nature was proving stubborn. Ethan sat down at his kitchen table, the county report still in its folder nearby. If the forecast was right, the heaviest rain hadn't even arrived yet, and when it did, the creek would have to choose. A path, through the narrow gap, over the barrier, or somewhere entirely unintended. By the time dawn broke, the rain had pounded the neighborhood for nearly 20 hours without pause. The usual gurgle of the creek was now a deep, constant rush, like distant traffic that never stopped. Ethan barely slept, waking often to check the water level. Each time it seemed a little higher. At first light, he put on boots and a raincoat, stepping out into the damp chill. The pond behind Karen's house had grown into something unrecognizable, a wide, restless expanse that shimmered under the low gray sky. The concrete barrier was invisible now, swallowed completely by the water. Karen's porch light was still on. She appeared moments later, pulling her robe tight and scanning the water with tired eyes. "It's over the barrier," Ethan called from the edge of his yard. She nodded grimly. "I know. I've been up all night checking." The pond was no longer content to stay within its banks. On one side, where the soil dipped near Karen's back fence, a steady sheet of water had begun spilling over, streaming across her lawn and into the side of her house. It was slow at first, the kind of trickle someone might ignore. But in the hours that followed, it widened into a determined flow. Ethan could see it collecting near the foundation, pooling in low spots before vanishing into a narrow gap, where the basement windows sat just above ground level. He walked a little closer. "That's heading straight for your basement wall," he said. Karen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she disappeared inside, and a few moments later, the mechanical hum of her sump pump filled the air. But the sound was steady, almost constant, with no relief between cycles, a sign the pump was already straining to keep up. The rain showed no mercy. By mid-morning, the sheet of water pouring off the flooded bank had grown faster, joined by another small breach further upstream. The creek had found its unintended path, just as Daniel had warned. Karen reappeared with a shovel, trying to dig a shallow trench to redirect the flow away from her foundation. The soil, however, was already waterlogged, collapsing back into the trench as quickly as she pulled it out. Ethan crossed the property line to help, pushing his boots into the muck and using his own spade to deepen the channel. The two of them worked in silence for several minutes, rain soaking their clothes and streaming down their faces. "This isn't working," Karen finally said, breathless. "The water's too fast." Ethan glanced toward the pond, now indistinguishable from the surrounding yard. "We could try sandbags," he suggested. Karen shook her head. "I don't have any. And even if I did..." She trailed off, her gaze shifting toward the side of her house. Water was now cascading against the foundation in more than one spot. A sudden metallic clank came from inside her home, followed by the low groan of machinery stopping. Karen froze. "That was my pump," she said. They both rushed to the basement door. The moment Karen opened it, the sound of rushing water met their ears, not outside, but from within. The concrete floor below was already covered in several inches of murky water, and it was rising steadily. Karen stood motionless for a moment, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and resignation. "It's coming in faster than I thought." Ethan put a hand on the railing, peering down. "We need to call for help before it gets any higher." She nodded, pulling out her phone. As she made the call, Ethan stepped back outside. The creek was still rising, the rain still falling, and the force of the water spilling into her yard had only increased. Nature had decided its course, and it wasn't the narrow gap in the concrete barrier. It was straight toward Karen's home, and now into it. By late morning, the rain was at its fiercest. The sky was a dense, unbroken gray, and every surface seemed to carry its own miniature river. Ethan stood under the edge of his porch, watching as the water overtopping the creek spread wider across Karen's yard, joining the main flow that had found its way into her basement. From inside her house came the muffled shouts of workers who had arrived with portable pumps and long hoses. They wasted no time, unspooling equipment and running thick tubes from her basement windows out into the soggy yard. The machinery roared to life, spitting great arcs of water back into the swollen creek. Karen emerged in a raincoat, her hair plastered to her forehead, speaking quickly to one of the crew members. She spotted Ethan and made her way over, boots sinking in the mud with each step. "They said it's already more than a foot deep down there," she said, her voice strained. "I've had to move what I could upstairs, but most of it—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Ethan offered a sympathetic nod. "At least you caught it early enough to keep it from reaching the electrical panel." She gave a half-hearted smile. Small victories. The pumps worked tirelessly, but the water coming in was relentless. For every gallon they removed, another seemed to pour back in through the foundation. Karen stayed outside, pacing between the workers, the creek, and the house. Her usual air of confidence replaced by something quieter, an attentiveness that bordered on humility. Around midday, the county inspector Daniel arrived, stepping carefully over the soaked lawn. He took one long look at the barrier, now entirely submerged, and the sprawling floodplain that had overtaken Karen's yard. "This is exactly the overflow pattern I mentioned," he said gently, his voice carrying, "just enough over the rain. The barrier slowed the water too much, and once it breached the bank, it found the lowest ground. Unfortunately, that's your basement." Karen didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I understand." Daniel turned to Ethan. "If the rain eases, soon we can stabilize the flow, but if it keeps up—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. By late afternoon, the rain finally began to taper, lightening from a pounding torrent to a persistent drizzle. The pump slowly gained the upper hand, and the water in Karen's basement began to recede. The workers cheered, quietly, as the level dropped below the basement windows. Karen stood beside Ethan, looking out at the creek, now a restless ribbon of water rushing along its natural path once more. "I didn't think it could happen here," she admitted. "I thought I was making something beautiful. I didn't realize it could work against me." Ethan glanced at her. "Water's like that. It doesn't hold grudges, but it doesn't compromise either. It just goes where it needs to." She managed a real smile then, the first he'd seen all day. "I guess I'll be talking to the county about taking that barrier down, maybe even putting the creek back how it was." "That's a good call," Ethan said. "It's easier to work with nature than against it." By evening, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the neighborhood washed clean but heavy with damp. The swollen creek was slowly shrinking back into its banks, carrying bits of leaves and debris downstream toward larger waters. Karen's yard was a muddy mess, and her basement would need weeks of repair. But the incident had shifted something in her. She no longer looked at the creek as a blank canvas for her ideas, but as a living part of the land, something to be respected. As the last of the workers packed up, she turned to Ethan. "Thank you for helping today. I know we haven't always agreed, but I appreciate you." Ethan simply nodded, glancing toward the water one last time. It moved freely now, unimpeded, as if relieved to have its path restored. And for the first time since the rain began, the neighborhood felt still again.